Before going to bed, my Omega husband brought me a glass of milk. I pretended to drink it because I hated milk. In the middle of the night, I was awakened by the shaking bed. When I opened my eyes, I found that my Omega was having sex with a strange alpha. The corners of my mouth twitched and I closed my eyes, pretending not to see it. Just when I was about to fall asleep again, the strange alpha suddenly grabbed my hand and interlocked our fingers. When I finished my shower and walked out of the room, Charles came in with a glass of milk. Half a year ago, he suddenly found me and made a deal with me. I married him and we were just a nominal couple, and he gave me 200,000 yuan in pocket money every month. Because he offered so much, I, a poor person, agreed without hesitation. As for why he came to me, I actually have some guesses. Since I was a child, because of my outstanding face, Alpha, Omega and Beta have been chasing me. I think maybe it was because of this face that he came to me. Otherwise, how could he, a rich young man with everything, be interested in a poor Beta like me? Thinking of this, I quickly accepted the reality. After marriage, he was very considerate to me, but he was also sensible enough not to cross the line. I am very satisfied. James, drink a glass of milk before going to bed. You will sleep better later. He put the milk on the table. I glanced at the milk and frowned slightly. To be honest, I don't like drinking before going to bed because it will make me wake up at night. I paused, then raised my head and fixed my gaze on the Omega. Charles was very handsome, with long, soft black hair hanging gently in front of him, red lips and white teeth, and a pair of peach blossom eyes that seemed to have hooks. As I looked at him, he nervously pinched the corner of his clothes. James, don't you like it? Charles pursed his lips, and his pink lips turned slightly red. No, you go out first. I'll blow dry my hair and then I'll drink. I found an excuse to get him out of the way. Okay, I'll go out first then. He nodded, looked at me lingeringly, and then left reluctantly. 2. After blow-drying my hair, I glanced at the milk on the table, picked up the cup and poured it into the toilet, then put the cup back where it belonged. Suddenly, there was a knock on the door. James, can I come in? The Omega's gentle voice came from the door. Come in, I said, pulling out a tissue and pretending to wipe my mouth. When Charles came in, he saw me wiping my mouth, then looked at the empty cup on the table and gave me a gentle smile. Go to sleep. I threw off the quilt and lay down in it. His side sank and the Omega joined him. I closed my eyes. In the middle of the night, when I was sleeping soundly, I was suddenly awakened by the shaking bed. I could hear low gasps and crazy curses. I quietly opened one eye and looked to the side. My Omega was currently performing some harmonious exercises with a strange alpha. It was obvious that the two of them were doing the most intimate thing in the world, but they were cursing at each other while doing it, as if they were enemies. The corners of my mouth twitched and I closed my eyes peacefully. After all, Charles and I are just a couple in name only, and what he does is none of my business. What's more, Alpha and Omega are the natural match. Why should I, a female Beta, get involved? But couldn't they just go to another room? They woke me up. I felt quite depressed. The wobbly bed was like a cradle, rocking me almost to sleep. Just when I was in a daze, a pair of bony hands suddenly held my hands and interlocked my fingers. The bed stopped shaking. Pa! A crisp slapping sound was heard. Charles, why did you hit me? The strange alpha was furious. To be honest, the voice of this alpha is very nice, deep and attractive. When I peeked at him just now, I also saw his face clearly. He has very neat short hair, sharp eyebrows and bright eyes, and is quite handsome. So I quietly pricked up my ears, ready to listen to their story. After all, judging from their looks alone, they are quite a good match. William, let go of your dog's paws. That's my Beta. Charles sneered. Huh? Your Beta? If you hadn't taken advantage of my absence, he would be my Beta now. William's voice was full of sarcasm. You bastard. I knew you were coveting him. Charles pushed William hard. Bang! There was a sound of landing, and William fell heavily to the ground. Charles, are you crazy? Aren't you afraid of waking him up by shouting so loudly? I put drugs in the milk. He can't wake up. How could I let him find out about this? Charles snorted. If it weren't for the fact that we are a 100% match, the fact that you covet James would be enough for me to kill you several times. Omega said grimly. Oh, what a coincidence, me too. The thought of doing this with you and marking you makes me sick. William was not to be outdone. After hearing their conversation, I fell into deep silence. Alpha and Omega, who are highly compatible, are a match made in heaven. Both parties cannot live without each other during their estrus period, so most alphas and omegas with a compatibility of up to 90% will become partners. This is the first time I've seen a 100% compatible alpha and omega not only fail to form a pair, but are also hostile to each other. And, judging from the situation, they all seem to have taken a fancy to me. Thinking of this, I moved my fingers, feeling confused. I'm a poor beta with only a pretty face. How could they like me? As William left, the room fell silent. After taking a shower, Charles got into bed again, still wet. He put his arms around my waist and rubbed my neck lovingly. James, you are mine. No one can take it away. That despicable man William actually dared to covet you. I won't let him go, Omega murmured. Hearing this, I frowned. He has always been well-behaved and considerate in front of me, but this is not something a well-behaved person would say. The paranoia and malice in his words made me feel slightly uncomfortable. Maybe he wasn't that well-behaved. If the Omega is well-behaved and sensible, then it is not a bad idea to live a peaceful life with him. But now his changes have made me hesitate whether to continue. 3. When I woke up the next day, I pretended nothing had happened. The virtuous Omega had already prepared breakfast, and when he saw me coming, he untied his apron and greeted me. James, come and have breakfast. He considerately pulled out a chair and I sat down. Omega picked up a steamed bun for me and stared at me nervously. How about trying it? Charles looked at me expectantly. I naturally picked up the steamed bun and put it in my mouth, then nodded and praised. Not bad. The Omega's eyes lit up and he smiled shyly, pursing his lips. Looking at his shy and timid smile, I felt complicated. He was not like this last night. That aggressive and paranoid attitude was totally different from what he is now. Seeing that I was looking at him, the Omega blinked slowly and then his ears turned red silently. James, this is my estrus period. Can you not go to the company today and stay with me at home? Looking at Omega's nervous and expectant eyes, I hesitated. My work in the company is very simple, but the salary is very high. If I didn't know my own strengths and weaknesses, I would almost think that this company belonged to my family. I have nothing to do every day and I slack off every day, yet I can still get such a high salary. Thinking of my salary, I shook my head decisively. No, you should stay home by yourself today. Omega's eyes dimmed. He lowered his eyes and stopped talking. His eyelashes trembled slightly, and a tear fell. It is naturally very beautiful to see a beautiful woman shedding tears. Unfortunately, all I can think about now is that I'm going to be late and will be deducted money. Okay, I have to go. I stood up, looking at the sad Omega and remembering the 200,000 yuan pocket money a month. I hesitated for a moment, then leaned over and kissed him on the lips. Charles paused, then wrapped his arms around my neck and deepened the kiss. That's enough. Pushed him away. The corners of the Omega's eyes were red and there were broken tears in his eyes. He took a breath and then looked at me with attachment. I'm leaving. I turned around decisively. 200,000 a month can only allow me to do this much. If I wasn't afraid that he would be in a bad mood and not pay me, I would not kiss him. For when I arrived at the company in Omega's luxury car, I arrived just on time and was almost late. The moment I stepped into the company, many eyes fell on me. From childhood to adulthood, I have always received a lot of attention because of my extremely outstanding face, like the moon in the cold sky. I wasn't used to it at first, but over the years I gradually got used to it. James is here. Good morning, James. Why is it so late today? My colleagues greeted me warmly, their burning gazes cast on my face. I responded seriously and then walked to my seat with difficulty. As I sat down, I sighed deeply. Tired, so tired. After taking a deep breath, I turned on the computer and started playing games. At noon, Omega called me. James, I'm here to bring you lunch. I'm already downstairs at your company. Charles's gentle voice came from the phone. Got it, I replied, then got up and went downstairs. Along the way, many vague gazes fell on me. When I got downstairs, I saw Charles right away. After all, that pretty face still stands out in the crowd. James, I'm here. When he saw me, the Omega's eyes lit up and a huge grin spread across his face. I walked over and took the lunchbox from his hand. Thank you, I said politely. James is always so polite to me. The Omega pursed his lips and hung his head in defeat, his black hair falling around his face with a sense of brokenness. I frowned in confusion, then reluctantly reached out and touched his head. Omega is such a hassle, he gets angry even if you're polite to him. I am quite distressed. Suddenly, he held my hand, put his face against my palm and rubbed it affectionately. He raised his eyes and looked straight at me. Can you come back early tonight? I have a surprise for you. Looking at his burning eyes, I was startled and quickly pulled my hand back. I understand. I'll go back early, I replied perfunctorily, then turned and left in a hurry. The look in his eyes just now was a little scary, as if he wanted to eat me. So weird. 5. When I get off work, I rarely linger in my seat and refuse to leave. In the past, I was always the fastest runner, but for some reason, when I thought of Omega's look, I kind of backed off. James, aren't you leaving yet? Do you want to go back together? An enthusiastic Beta walked up to me. No, I'll be back soon. I shook my head and rejected Beta's request. Okay. Beta walked away disappointed. As it got dark, everyone in the company left. I sighed and went home resignedly. As soon as you entered the house, you were greeted by your Omega with a worried look on his face. Why are you back so late today? He asked as he helped me take off my shoes. I was delayed by something at the company. I made up an excuse. After hearing this, Omega believed it. When I walked to the table, I noticed something was different. Candles, red roses, it looks like a candlelight dinner. Looking at this unusual scene, I became silently alert. Omega served me food as usual and I ate it in peace. The meal made me feel particularly uneasy. After dinner, he took my hand and went into the room. James, wait for me for a moment. Charles lowered his eyes, looking particularly shy. I sat by the bed, waiting for him quietly. Omega is a little strange today, I thought quietly. Suddenly, the door opened. When I heard the voice, I looked up and was stunned. Omega usually has the image of a gentle and shy husband. In addition, he comes from a wealthy family, so he always dresses appropriately and is gentle and dignified. But at this moment, the Omega was wearing an extremely sexy dress, which was thin and had only a few pieces of fabric. It looks very different from the past. I calmly withdrew my gaze, feeling confused. It was agreed to be a contractual marriage, and neither party has crossed the line during this period of time. Why did he start to change today? Could it be that the words of that strange alpha made him feel a sense of crisis? James. The Omega walked in front of me and spoke in a trembling voice. He knelt in front of me, rested his chin on my legs, and looked at me hesitantly with his sparkling peach eyes. Tonight, how about that? The Omega suggested. Don't forget, ours is just a contract marriage, and the treaty doesn't require me to sacrifice myself, I reminded him. As soon as those words left his mouth, the Omega's face turned pale and his eyes filled with tears. He held my hand in panic and looked at me anxiously. I'm sorry, I overstepped my bounds. Omega's tears fell, and he cried like a mess. I looked at his tear-stained face and fell silent. After a while, he spoke in a hoarse voice. I can pay more. I paused and opened my eyes wide in surprise. Add money? Then should I sleep or not? I felt conflicted. After a moment, I asked cautiously, how much? I won't do it for little money. How about I give you an extra 200,000 yuan a month? Omega asked cautiously. I started to calculate frantically in my head. If I gave him an extra 200,000, that would mean 400,000 per month. Make money, don't lose money. Maybe I took too long to think. which made Omega a little flustered. So he raised his head nervously and looked at me hesitantly. If it's too little, you can add more. I looked down in surprise and met the Omega's tearful eyes. After hesitating, I shook my head and refused. It's okay. This is enough. It would be impolite to take it again. Isn't it just dedication? I can do it. Seeing that I agreed, he pursed his lips and showed a happy smile. The Omega obediently placed his face in my hand, rubbing it gently. He tentatively reached out and wrapped his arms around my waist. Seeing that I didn't refuse, the Omega's eyes lit up and he sat astride me. James, can you kiss me? Charles put his arms around my neck and looked at me expectantly. Okay, I replied casually, then reached out and pinched his chin and kissed his thin lips. The Omega trembled with excitement. When he tried to kiss my neck, I pushed him away. What's wrong? Charles raised his watery eyes and looked at me dazedly. The Omega exclaimed, and in a blink of an eye, he was pinned to the bed by me. I'll get straight to the point. I have to go to work tomorrow, so I don't have time for all this foreplay, which is just wasting my sleep time. Afterwards, the Omega crawled into my arms and hugged me lovingly. I felt suffocated by his hug, so I quickly pushed him away. Stop it. I have to go to work tomorrow. My tone was cold and impatient, worthy of a heartless scumbag who pulled up his pants. The Omega was stunned by my push, and he seemed unable to react as to why his partner, who was so intimate with him a second ago, suddenly became so cold. He clutched the sheets beneath him helplessly, not daring to come any closer to me. After a while, a low whimpering sound came from the side. I turned around and saw Omega burying his head in the quilt, sobbing. I silently withdrew my gaze, feeling helpless and irritated. If he keeps crying, I won't sleep. For the high salary, I decided to comfort Omega. So I reached out, put my arms around his waist, and whispered, "Stop crying." Hearing my voice, he quieted down. After a while, he cautiously poked his head out and tentatively kissed my lips. Seeing that I didn't show any impatience, he pursed his lips and smiled, then went further and hugged my waist. The force was very light, as if he was afraid of being pushed away by me. Seeing that he finally calmed down, I didn't push him away and allowed him to hug me. I closed my eyes and fell asleep quickly. If you don't sleep now, don't remember it tomorrow. 6. The next day, when I got up, Omega had already prepared breakfast. I finished breakfast and was about to leave. Suddenly, he called me. James, can't you stay with me today? The Omega pinched the corner of his clothes and looked at me nervously. Perhaps the intimacy between the two of us last night gave him great courage, so before I left today, he plucked up the courage to speak and tried to keep me. No, I will be deducted money if I take leave. I rejected him coldly. Omega's eyes turned red and he looked at me in dismay. Is there anything else? If not, I'm leaving. As soon as he finished speaking, I turned around and prepared to leave without even waiting for his answer. James, why don't you quit your job and come to my company? Just put your name on the list. You don't have to do anything. I'll give you a salary of $100,000 a month. Okay? The Omega quickly stepped forward and grabbed my waist from behind. Hearing this, I stopped. I have always known that Omega is very rich and comes from a wealthy family. He is the only child of his parents and he has always been the darling of the family. What's more, he is very capable and has started his own company, which is now developing better and better. So his promise is credible. I weighed the options quickly in my mind. My current company pays me $50,000 a month, and Omega can pay me $100,000 a month. And the work is equally leisurely. I thought about it for a moment, then nodded decisively and agreed, okay, if you don't take advantage of a good deal, you'll miss it. Hearing what I said, Omega walked up to me and threw himself into my arms excitedly. Then why don't you quit your job today? I'll pick you up when you get off work, he said excitedly. I understand. I nodded. 7. After arriving at the company, I turned on my computer and started playing games as usual. It's fun to slack off for a while, and it's always fun to slack off all the time. Time flies quickly, and in the blink of an eye it's time to get off work. Ding-ling-ling. My phone rang. I answered the call. James, I'm almost downstairs at your company. It's so tiring waiting outside. Can I come into the company to find you? Omega said coquettishly. I glanced at my colleague who was starting to pack up and agreed to his request. Come in. James is the best. Omega's joyful voice came from the other end of the phone. After hanging up the phone, I suddenly remembered that I hadn't submitted my resignation letter yet. So I stood up and handed my resignation letter to my boss. As a useless person who does nothing but gets paid a high salary, I thought my boss was eager for me to leave. But to my surprise, my boss took the resignation letter hesitantly, with a conflicted look on his face. James, I can't make the decision on this matter. Wait a moment. I'll go tell the president and see what he decides. The boss said this and left in a hurry. Looking at his flustered back, I was at a loss. When I resign, will I have to trouble the president again? What's more, I've been in the company for so long, but I don't even know who the president is. I was quite nervous about suddenly having to have contact with the president. Soon, the boss came back. James, come in. The president wants to see you. He patted my shoulder. Ah, I looked confused. Seeing me like this, my boss comforted me. It's okay. The president is a very nice person. When the boss mentioned the 3 words, a very good person, his face twisted and he looked insincere. Seeing him like this, it suddenly dawned on me. It seems that this president has nothing to do with the word good guy. After saying goodbye to my boss, I walked nervously to the president's office. When I reached the door, I knocked politely. Come in. A deep and pleasant voice sounded. The sound was nice, but a little familiar, as if I had heard it somewhere before. I hesitated for a second, then pushed the door open suspiciously. After entering the door, I saw the president sitting in a chair with his back to me. Hearing the door open, he tiptoed and turned the chair around. A familiar handsome face came into view. It's William, the alpha who slept with Charles while they cursed at each other. Thinking of this leisurely, high-paying job and William's coveting of me, I suddenly understood. No wonder the salary is high and the work is easy. I thought there really were such bosses who took advantage of others in this world. I didn't expect that my boss had bad intentions towards me. I felt complicated. I heard you were going to resign. Why? Did a colleague bully you? Or is your salary not high enough? William stood up and walked in front of me. Although he was a head taller than me, he bent down and stared into my eyes with loss. The whole person looks like a pitiful puppy abandoned by its owner. It's an illusion, it must be an illusion. How could William look like a puppy? I pondered. James, please don't quit your job. I can help you solve any problem you have. The tall alpha carefully took my hand and his burning gaze fell on me. It's no problem. No one bullies me, and I don't have any complaints. It's just that my Omega asked me to quit here and go to his company. He offered me double the salary. I tell the truth. After all, there is nothing to hide. The alpha's eyes darkened, trying hard to hide his anger. After a moment, he seemed to have thought of something and began to slowly undress his clothes. I can also double your salary. Stay here. You can get whatever salary you want, and even I can be yours. He held my hand and placed my hand on his chest. The touch under the palm is warm, soft, and elastic. I pressed lightly and my finger sank into it. The pecs are huge and the body is great. I came to a conclusion. This is a body completely different from Charles's. Charles is thin and frail and looks weak and pitiful. William's body is full of strength, but his chest muscles are well developed, which creates a contrast. Male mom, I murmured. What? He was stunned for a moment, as if he didn't hear what I said clearly. Nothing. I changed the subject as if nothing had happened, feeling guilty inside. The half-naked alpha and the beautiful beta, plus their actions at the moment, no one would believe that they were innocent. The atmosphere began to become ambiguous. Suddenly, the door was pushed open. What are you doing? Charles's angry voice sounded behind him. I looked back and found that he was glaring at William with red eyes and anger on his face. His eyes were filled with hatred and malice towards William. When he saw me looking back, he panicked for a moment, then quickly restrained his expression and pretended to be sad and desperate. James, am I disturbing you? The Omega had tears in his eyes and he covered his lips and cried. You know you're disturbing us, so why don't you get out now? William sneered and looked at the Omega smugly. Omega was irritated by William's eyes and could no longer pretend to be weak and innocent. He rushed forward and slapped William in the face. How dare you seduce him, bitch? You shameless slut. You're an alpha and you have the nerve to be a mistress. Omega pulled William's hair, beat and scolded him. William didn't fight back. He just looked at me aggrievedly. James, look at him. This scumbag hit me. As soon as I finished speaking, Omega froze, as if he suddenly remembered that I was still there. So he quickly let go, hurriedly tidied his hair, and looked at me hesitantly. James, I'm not usually like this. I was just too angry. Omega's charming peach blossom eyes were filled with broken tears. The corners of his eyes were red, and even the tip of his nose turned red out of grievance. Two pairs of equally aggrieved eyes looked at me at the same time. My intuition told me that it was best not to speak at this time, so I stared at the floor in silence, quietly being a mute husband. James, say something. William gently pinched the corner of my clothes. Seeing William's actions, Omega became angry again. He pushed William away, then turned and threw himself into my arms. Seeing that they were about to fight again, I closed my eyes and pretended to be faint. There is no way, I really can't control it. As I was pretending, I fell asleep. When I woke up again, I was in the hospital. The Omega was sitting on the bed, propping his head up and dozing off, his head nodding. I moved my body and tried to get up. James, are you awake? Omega woke up suddenly upon noticing my movements. Yeah. I nodded coldly. The doctor said you were fine. You just fell asleep. But how could a healthy person fall asleep in a second while standing? What a bunch of quacks. Can I change your hospital? Omega looked at me with concern. Hearing his words, I looked away guiltily. After all, I did fall asleep. Cough, cough, cough. I coughed lightly in embarrassment. What's wrong with you? Are you feeling uncomfortable? He suddenly became nervous, his eyes turning red with anxiety. Omega quickly pressed the call bell at the bedside. A large group of doctors rushed into the ward, and my coughing movements froze. After a series of inspections, they came to a conclusion. I am in very good health and can be discharged from the hospital. The Omega frowned, looking unconvinced. Doctor, he was coughing just now. Are you sure everything is okay? Charles looked at me worriedly. The examination results show that he is indeed healthy. The doctor said calmly. I'm fine, let's go home. I spoke quickly, interrupting their conversation. There was nothing wrong in the first place, and it was awkward to stay in the hospital. After hearing what I said, Charles was still worried, but he nodded and took me out of the hospital. 9. In the evening, Charles was particularly enthusiastic. As soon as I lay down on the bed, he couldn't wait to get into my arms and rub against me here and there. He gently scratched the palm of my hand, pursed his lips and smiled shyly, his charming peach blossom eyes looking straight at me. I lay there like a corpse, unmoved. The Omega gave me a disappointed look, then reluctantly kissed my lips. James, I feel uncomfortable. He panted, his face flushed and his brows tightly furrowed. Omega's estrus period must be accompanied and marked by alpha, otherwise it will be extremely difficult. Previously, although Charles and William did not get along with each other, due to their 100% compatibility, they could not do without each other during their estrus period. So they all accepted it with a pinch of their nose. Because of William's presence, Charles's estrus period is not that difficult, so naturally he won't be impatient to stick to me. This makes me very satisfied. But the conflict that broke out in the office this time made the two of them completely unable to tolerate each other's existence. So this time, Omega has to go through his estrus period by himself. Perhaps because he could not get comfort from the alpha, Charles's estrus period was particularly difficult and he desperately needed the comfort of his lover. So he almost couldn't wait to stick to me and couldn't be torn away. James, can you kiss me? The Omega pressed his face against the side of my neck, kissing it delicately. The hot breath fell beside my ears, making me frown subconsciously. At this moment, I suddenly missed William's presence very much. Even though I would be woken up by their shaking bed, at least Omega's wouldn't be that clingy. I sighed and reached out to nudge his head. The breath was too hot for me to handle. Noticing my indifference, the already uncomfortable Omega suddenly burst into tears out of heartache. He retreated away from me, then covered his chest and cried. The tears soon soaked the pillow. I turned around and saw that Omega's hair, wet with tears, was sticking to one side of his cheek in a mess, making him look extremely vulnerable. Seeing me looking at him, he raised his wet eyes, which were full of sadness and loss. I looked at him, motionless. As I watched, the Omega panicked. "I'm sorry. Did my voice disturb you?" He wiped the tears from his face and forced a smile. Looking at the smile on his face that was uglier than crying, I lowered my eyes and pursed my lips in distress. After a while, I gently kissed his lips. The Omega paused, then tentatively responded to me. Seeing that I didn't refuse, he was delighted and put his arms around my neck, letting me take what I wanted. Seeing the Omega's slightly red eyes and confused and longing look, I almost sighed in my heart. This money is indeed not that easy to get. I resigned myself to my fate and undressed him. In fact, my patience is wearing thin. I like a peaceful and stable life. Obviously, what has happened recently has really caught me off guard. In the beginning, I agreed to this contract marriage just for the money, but Omega's obedience and generosity made me a little more patient with him. Unfortunately, he is becoming more and more excessive and clingy. I am a cold person and I hate clingy partners the most. After all these things happened, I have begun to think about ending my contract marriage. After all, I am essentially a selfish person and I love myself the most. 10. Fortunately, Omega's estrus period has finally ended. I had originally agreed to join Omega's company after resigning, but since William never agreed, the resignation was shelved. Therefore, even though I had been absent from work for a few days, I still had to go to work. After Omega knew about this, he was extremely dissatisfied and his disgust towards William skyrocketed. "James, can I help you leave?" "If I help, William will have to agree even if he refuses." Charles held my hand. "No thanks," I said calmly. After all this trouble, I gave up the idea of quitting my job. What's more, after spending these few days together, I have a better understanding of how clingy Charles is. If I go to Charles's company, I don't think I'll have a peaceful life. It's fine if he sticks to me at home, but if he sticks to me at work too, I'll really collapse. Seeing my refusal, Omega pursed his lips in disappointment. "Then you should go early and come back early." He let go of my hand and looked at me reluctantly. I turned around and left without hesitation. 11. When I returned to the company again, I felt like I was in a different world. Sure enough, it is more comfortable to stay in the company. I turned on the computer skillfully and started playing games. "James, the president is calling you." My boss came over and knocked on my desk. "Got it." I moved my eyes away from the computer and nodded to my boss. The moment I pushed open the door of the president's office, a joyful and burning gaze immediately fell on me. When I looked up, I met William's joyful eyes. "James, you're here." He stood up excitedly and walked towards me. I don't know what he was thinking about, but he politely stopped 3 steps away from me. Seeing his actions, I nodded with relief. "Very good. I like this kind of sensible and non-clingy person." Seeing my gratified look, his eyes suddenly lit up and the corners of his mouth curled up with joy. "What's wrong, President?" After coming to my senses, I looked up at him. "Don't call me President. Just call me William." He looked at me expectantly, as if he particularly hoped that I would change my words. "William." I changed my words readily. William's eyes lit up with joy. "Nothing, actually. I noticed that you like playing games, and I just happen to have a few new games here that I thought might be of interest to you." He touched his nose, and his ears turned red with nervousness. I looked at him in surprise, looking him up and down. Unexpectedly, he was so attentive that he actually knew that I liked to play games. Thank you very much. I nodded. I sat in front of the computer and started playing the new game on it. William sat aside, quietly handling his work, occasionally looking up and glancing at me quietly. The atmosphere between the two seems particularly harmonious. Time passed quickly, and when I got off work, William offered to take me home. Thinking of today's extremely fun games, I hesitated for a moment and then nodded. For the sake of the game, it should be okay to take a ride. After arriving downstairs of my house, William walked to the passenger seat, opened the door for me considerately, and put his hand on my head for fear that I would hit my head. I nodded politely to him and started to leave. The moment I turned around, I saw Charles not far away staring at William grimly. Seeing that I noticed him, he quickly withdrew his gloomy gaze and walked over to me pretending nothing had happened. William, thank you for bringing James back. But next time I'll pick him up so I won't have to bother you. The Omega took my hand, secretly asserting his sovereignty. How can it be a trouble? I'm happy to send him back. It's not a trouble at all, William retorted. The Omega's grip tightened for a moment, and he looked at William with jealousy. Seeing the two people in front of me start to confront each other again, I suddenly felt tired. How come I didn't know Charles was so possessive and easily jealous before I met William? Obviously, he had always been gentle, calm, generous, and not clingy. Thinking of this, I suddenly felt upset. This tense and confrontational scene in front of me makes me feel bored and tired. You guys chat. I'm leaving. I pulled Omega's hand away and turned away. James, wait for me. The Omega hurriedly caught up. After returning home, I lay on the sofa and closed my eyes to rest. James. The Omega sat next to me and carefully pulled at the hem of my shirt. Charles, let's get a divorce. I opened my eyes and looked at the Omega. Hearing this, the Omega's face turned pale and tears were about to fall from his eyes. He looked at me almost in disbelief, holding his chest and breathing heavily, almost suffocating. Are you divorcing me because of William? Because of him, Charles said word by word, gritting his teeth. No, I shook my head. The Omega was stunned for a moment, then muttered, Then why did you divorce me? We were in a contractual marriage, and there was no love between us to begin with, and now I don't want to continue. Besides, the contract time has come. I raised my eyes and looked at the Omega seriously. It was a wrong start. I have no feelings for Omegas, and now the two of them are in such a mess. This annoys me to no end. James, don't do this to me. Tell me what's wrong with me and I'll change it. Okay? Omega held my hand and tears fell one by one. He looked straight at me, unwilling to look away. Let's get a divorce. Don't make me hate you. I sighed. As soon as he said this, he froze. After a while, he let go of her hand in despair. Then, after the divorce, can I pursue you seriously? Since the beginning of this marriage was a mistake, can you give me a chance to pursue you? Let's start over. Please. The Omega whimpered and looked at me almost pleadingly. Okay. I closed my eyes, not daring to look into his eyes. Actually, I lied. I had already planned to buy a plane ticket and leave here to live in another city after the divorce. But I knew I couldn't tell him the truth. Otherwise, he would definitely not want to get a divorce. James, thank you. Omega wiped his tears and looked at me with longing. 12. A few days later, we arrived at the Civil Affairs Bureau. The moment he stepped through the door, the Omega hesitated. James, can we not get a divorce? He grabbed the corner of my clothes and looked at me with red eyes. No, I said coldly. The Omega pursed his lips in defeat, then let go of his hand dejectedly. I understand, he said in a hoarse voice. When I got the divorce certificate, I was still a little bit surprised. Things went even better than I thought. As we walked out the door, Omega grabbed my hand. What's wrong? I turned to look at him. Kiss me again, please? The Omega tilted his head back and begged. I paused, then held the back of his head and kissed him. Never mind, just consider it as compensation for cheating on him. After the kiss, I turned and left, and the Omega's reluctant eyes followed me all the time. After returning home, I quickly packed my things and left the house quickly before Omega came back. 13. After leaving home, I rented a small house and began to think about planning my future life and the city I would go to in the future. Omega didn't bother me for a whole month, which made me feel relieved. If he doesn't bother me, I can stay here a little longer without having to rush away. Ding-ling-ling. The cell phone suddenly rang. I glanced at the screen and saw it was Omega calling. After hesitating for a moment, I answered the call. James, can I come to see you? Omega's gentle voice came from the other end of the phone. The tone was still gentle and calm, but I always felt something was weird. So I, who was still hesitating, quickly made up my mind. No, I refused decisively. Then when can I come to see you? I miss you so much, he said aggrievedly. Let's talk about it later, I said casually. Once the words were spoken, the Omega fell silent. After a moment, he chuckled and said, You are lying to me, aren't you? You don't want to see me at all and you don't want to start over with me. Everything I said before was false. James, you have no heart. His voice was low and bitter, and every word he spoke was filled with heavy sorrow and despair. I held the phone in silence. I know where you are. I will find you, he sneered and said sinisterly. The call was disconnected and my heart sank. His obsession with me is beyond imagination. As a young master of a wealthy family, I definitely cannot leave as long as he doesn't want me to leave. I had to find a way to leave. I was frantically thinking of a solution in my mind, when suddenly a name flashed through my mind. William, Charles's archenemy. With his help, I would definitely be able to leave. Thinking of this, I quickly called William. After the call was connected, William's delighted voice came. James, why are you calling me? William, I want to leave, but Charles won't let me. Can you help me? I softened my tone for once. Why are you leaving? William was very depressed. Without waiting for my answer, he continued muttering. It must be the work of that madman Charles. With his madness, who wouldn't be afraid of him? Don't worry, I will help you, he said firmly. Very good, William even found a reason for me. I nodded with satisfaction. Then I'll leave tomorrow, the sooner the better, I said softly. Okay, I'll be ready. I breathed a sigh of relief after I hung up the phone. Fortunately, William is not as paranoid as Charles, and he always responds to my requests. Even though my leaving would make him extremely sad, he would rather respect my choice. I sat on the sofa and exhaled. 14. The next day, I rushed to the airport with my luggage. Buy your departure ticket today. I pulled my suitcase and took a taxi to the airport. As I expected, there were indeed many strange vehicles following me along the way, trying to force the vehicle I was in to stop. But fortunately, those cars were stopped by William's men. I clenched my hands nervously. The moment I successfully arrived at the airport, I breathed a sigh of relief. I arrived at the perfect time, and I was about to check in and board the plane. Suddenly, a familiar voice came from behind. James, don't go. Omega ran over from a distance in panic. Charles, don't even think about stopping him. William pushed Charles to the ground. When Charles appeared, I froze. When I saw him being held down by William, I tightened my grip and started running as fast as I could, fearing that the Omega would catch up with me. I ignored the Omega's desperate cries behind me and got on the plane by myself. The money I have saved during this period is enough for me to live a comfortable life for the rest of my life. The moment I got on the plane and looked at the scenery outside the window, I felt a sense of relief in my heart. Now that I'm free, it's better to be single. I'll be single for the rest of my life.